Hi, I'm Leilani Smith, and today I will be talking about Jim Crow laws, black art, culture, and resistance, and um, Web Du Bois. So, the first topic I want to talk about is Jim Crow. Jim Crow is basically the laws that were in place in order to control black people as much as possible without slavery, basically. So, a common myth about Jim Crow is that it was meant to have restrictions for whites and blacks, but in reality, it was just restrictions towards black people. So a lot of the restrictions that they had were property ownership, political rights, employment opportunities, education, healthcare, where they could live, and especially in public places. So in remembering Jim Crow, um, the excerpt that we read during this lesson, um, one of the things that really stuck out to me was the story about Stein George's father getting a house from his boss, and then how William, the father, wasn't he wasn't wanted by the white people in the community or by his boss's sons. So basically, while his family was sleeping, they burned the house down, and the house was just gone. Like, they could no longer live there. And it also killed two of William's children while they were living in the house, which was such a sad story for me to hear. And yeah. So another one that I want to talk about is Theresa Lyons. She had some excerpts from Jim Crow, and she talks about how a black principal basically went into a white owned business, and he was beaten because he asked for meat, but he wasn't beaten because he asked for meat, but he was beaten because he asked for meat in a white owned public place, basically. So they beat him. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it was basically to death, but yeah, I just think that was really crazy. And this is all based on like racial capitalism, which was a very important topic during this section. And it's basically how capitalism is dependent and sustained through the dehumanization of inequality, which was black labor was basically the foundation for the Southern economy. So the next thing I want to talk about is the black art and culture resistance, or black art, culture, and resistance. Basically, black people created one of the most influential genres of music in the 20th century, which is the blues, which is what I want to focus on in this section. The origins of the blues are basically from the songs that enslaved people used to sing while they were working in the fields, which is so sad and like crazy to think about. Like, people were listening to this music, not really listening to the music, which I feel like you can connect to what people do now. Like, people can listen to songs nowadays and they won't like really listen to the lyrics. So basically, the blues was basically a blend of pain and song. So like, they turned their sadness into music. It was based on jobs that they had to work after slavery. So domestic labor, sharecropping, and the convict lease system were basically a lot of what black people had to do after slavery had gone through, which was basically almost like keeping them enslaved without calling it slavery. Um, it and the music symbolized the frustrations of black people while they were going through Jim Crow in the South. So instead of like, black people didn't really have an outlet to like express themselves, so they did it through the blues, and it just so happened that like people enjoyed listening to it. So yeah. And then the last thing I want to talk about is Web Du Bois. Web Du Bois was a highly educated man, and he's actually came up with the philosophy of racial uplift, which is basically that if black people had higher education, that they could be in higher positions in society. So I feel like this is a good example nowadays because you see figures like Barack Obama, who's a very well educated black man who was our first black president in the United States. Um, Webb Du Bois was also known as the father of sociology, but because, of course, he was a black man and he was one of the first black people to even get a PhD from Harvard, he was basically, his ideas were shunned because of the white supremacy that was going on during that time. But he wrote a study called The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, and it was basically an analysis with qualitative and quantitative data of black people in Philadelphia based on poverty, unemployment, housing, health disparities, and barriers that they had there at the time. So he had all this data, but his data was not accepted until 5, 6 decades later because black people weren't accepted in that time period. So the importance of all of this is that black people not only helped the economy in the South, but they helped the culture of it. You can see how they helped the economy because things like Jim Crow, like they had to work, they had to work for the white people, even though like they had no choice because they couldn't work for themselves because they weren't like able to be in that sort of level of power. And then you can see like people like Webb Du Bois who have continued to put into our society today, and yeah, and now it's accepted, but it wasn't accepted back then. And then things that this has changed in my life, as a black woman, I've always known that bits and pieces of the story exist, like Jim Crow. Like you hear little things about it, but you hear the whole story. So to hear the whole story and seeing the truth of everything really like hit home, and it makes me see how my ancestors really walked so I could run. They lived through those battles and they went through those situations so that I wouldn't have to go through it today, which I'm so very grateful for. And then I plan on applying this to my life. I will always remember to appreciate what I have so that I can do better for my ancestors because they couldn't do the things that I could do today. So